Well, Dr. Tan, thank you for joining us for Digital Narratives of Asia. It's our oral history initiative by the Institute for Societal Leadership. So thank you for this privilege. So you have had a storied career. You started as an academic. You rose through the ranks at OCBC to become general manager. You were appointed chairman of Singapore Bar Service, and then you joined politics. And after winning a Sembawang seat, you very swiftly started as a Minister of State for Education, rising to become the Minister of Trade and Industry, Education, Health, Finance, and on your return to cabinet, you became Deputy Prime Minister. And after years in the corporate world as Chairman of Singapore Press Holdings, and after retiring from politics, you contested and was elected as the 7th President of the Republic of Singapore. And now post-presidency, we find ourselves in this office at Singapore Management University, where you are now the honorary patron. It's almost like a full circle, the story arc of your career, of your life, coming back to where you first started, which is academia. Of all the leadership roles that you have played, which one would you remember the most fondly? Which one did you enjoy the most?
If of all the ministries which I entered, the one which I found most engaged in, and where my wife also found most engaged in, was the Ministry of Defense. And there was a special reason for it, because here in Singapore, we have a national service military. We have a small professional army there, but basically they are to train. But the bulk of our soldiers are national servicemen. Now, national servicemen are actually young men, just out of school. When they finish polytechnic or A-levels or school, then they serve in the military for 2 or 3 years. So they are not professional soldiers. And I found it very encouraging to see these young men, literally boys actually, coming out, and within 1-2 years turn into professional soldiers. And my wife and I had the opportunity to accompany them on their training stints here in Singapore, as well as in Brunei, as well as in Australia, in Taiwan, and various places. And it gives me a tremendous sense of satisfaction to see our own young men rising up to the occasion, becoming professional soldiers, and actually being able to work with other soldiers from other militaries who have made a career out of their profession, and giving off their best, and also, I think, drawing very favorable comments on their performance. That gives you a tremendous sense of satisfaction, and we enjoyed it tremendously, mixing with the national service. Of course, I also spent a lot of time visiting military units, both in the Army as well as in the Navy. I sailed on ships, and also I went up in aeroplanes. I know that's something different from other ministries. Every ministry has got its challenges. You have got to, there are meetings you have to attend, there are people you have to meet, there are occasions you have to, but it's only in the SCF that you get to meet this whole variety of experiences which for most people you don't really get a chance to experience. So I would say that I found very satisfying. But having said that, every ministry I found something very interesting, particularly when the times were difficult and you had to focus your mind.
How about challenges? If there are so many of this portfolio, so many highlights like you have mentioned, and you were mentioning earlier that the difficult times you have to focus. If there is one portfolio that you found the most challenging, what would that be?
That's a very good question. Yeah? I would say conceptually, the portfolio, which I found most difficult to define, set targets, be clear about what you want to do and what results you are likely to get and the consequences, is education. Education is somewhat different from other ministries. First of all, it's always, every person in Singapore believes he or she knows how to run the education. Either they have been to school, university, or they have a child who is in school or university, and they have their aspirations. So it's difficult to define an educational policy which would suit everyone. And also there's many faceted aspects of education. It's not only the professional training. You must give students a very good academic background. They must be prepared for their studies to be able to carry on later on. But at the same time, you also want to teach them strong values as well. And how to balance all of these, I think, is a real challenge. The other aspect of education, which I found difficult, was the time scale. In other ministries, particularly in finance, for example, you make a mistake, you know it straight away within 1-2 months, and you can correct it. In education, the time scale is in years, 7-8 years, before you can see a difference. And if you make a serious error, by the time you found out about it and then you change it, essentially one generation of students would have been impaired, or their learning would have suffered. So I was very careful to think through all of these. The nature of education also changes. What we are doing now in Singapore, because of a change of our economy, is emphasizing very much on skills, for example. At the time when I was education minister, it was to give students a solid academic background, and also to prepare them for continuing education, whether it's in the ITE or in the polytechnics or in the universities. And in a sense, the skills part was very important, but not to the extent that we have here. So education has to change with the times, and has to take into account the needs of the economy, the aspirations of parents, also of young people, and also the circumstances change.
If I take you back to all your various roles in the 5 decades that you are in your corporate life, Dr. Tony Tan as an academic, Dr. Tony Tan as a banker, Dr. Tony Tan as a politician, and Dr. Tony Tan as president. How different are you in each of these roles? And have you changed in your leadership style?
So I would hope that I have learned more, and that I now consult more people. I think the value of feedback is very important now, particularly today, because social media has changed the whole way people interact with each other now. In the past, actually, it was much simpler because there's a mainstream press, and then there's a certain news cycle, you have time. Today, social media changes everything. Something comes up, and you have to reply instantly. And the news cycle is so short. Let me give you one example about why it's important. I was in Germany on some official trip, and there was this riot which took place in Little India. This was in 2013, I think something so. Like it, yes. Right? And so we were having dinner in Germany. Germany is about 6 hours, I think. We are 6, so it must have been about 11-12 p.m. here. And one of my security officers told me, "Do you know there was a riot?" And I did not get the information from the government. It was some member of public who had taken a video of what was happening, put it on YouTube, right? And I saw the video, and we are not used to this in Singapore. Cars burning and so on. It looked very serious indeed. So that disturbed me a great deal. And then I wanted to find out more immediately. So I managed to get in touch with, I knew that DPM Teo Chee Hean was going to hold a press conference. This must have been about 1 a.m. or something in the morning here. So after discussing with him, I decided this is a very unusual situation in Singapore, because this type of riot, and there was a racial element to it as well. I should come out with a statement in order to calm people down, tell them don't take the law into your own hands, work with the authorities, preserve our multiracial harmony. Now the challenge there is how to do it in a time zone 6 hours different from Singapore. It was about 9 p.m. in Singapore, much of 2-3 a.m. here. And then to craft a statement within 1 or 2 hours, get it back to Singapore so that it could be on a news cycle, because I thought it was very important that when the press reports the news the next day with all the comments from the ministers, DPM Teo, that my statement should be there, because if you miss that cycle, then it's not the same. See? Well, it was quite a scramble, but we managed to do it. So I think it must have got to Singapore about 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning. Fortunately, they were able to get it in time for the press the next day, and I think I hope that it made a difference, because everything helps to stabilize after that. But it shows a different type of world. The time scale has shrunken, and to be relevant now, you have to work with these new circumstances. If you miss the news cycle, then it's no longer news anymore.
You mentioned this whole change in the time scale of the last 5 decades, really. I mean, politics have changed significantly since you entered government in 1979 to where it is today. What do you think, apart from social media, apart from the speed of information, what do you think has changed in Singapore politics, in your opinion, both as an observer as well as an active player?
Well, I think that we have a different population now. We have a population who is much more aware of the world today. We have a population who have different aspirations. When I joined politics, even in '79, and particularly in the earlier years when we were in the 60s, 70s, 80s, something, people's aspirations were, in a sense, more straightforward. Get education, get a job, get a home, provide for your families, make sure children are well educated. So it's fairly straightforward. These are concrete items, and as a member of parliament in Sembawang, when I go, these are the things which people talk to me about. The day-to-day problems, and this sometimes you can help them. I try to do as much as I can, but it's understandable. But I think today is different. People now want not only, their aspirations have changed. So everybody travels nowadays, particularly with these low-cost flights. So then they are aware of what's happening. Singapore is an open society, so they look at television, they look at YouTube, they see what happens. And it's a more varied structure today. And relating to this, I believe it's much more difficult for the MP or the minister today, because he's dealing with a constantly changing set of circumstances and frameworks. It's also much more demanding, because it's a sort of a 24-hour, 7-day job. And as I said, sometimes there's not enough time to think through all the consequences, but you have to adapt to it. I'm afraid I don't see this changing. Technology is such today that anybody can put anything they like on the internet, and some of this goes viral, and it may be fake news, but it has an impact on people. How to correct that is very, very difficult indeed. And but it's something which is necessary. Every time you say something, people may misconstrue it. And also, I mean, with the mainstream press at least, when it's published, it's edited, somebody reads it, somebody makes sure it's right. With the internet, everybody is his own producer and distributor. There is no filter, and yet he has a potential to reach everyone, and sometimes it can be very widespread indeed.
Yeah.
And that's very difficult to, sometimes can be quite dangerous indeed.
Was it difficult for you back then to consider politics? I mean, you must have some time being asked to mull over and make your decision whether to join the PAP back then as well as to contest. So if I can bring you all the way back to 1979 and prior to 1979, was it a difficult decision for you personally?
Of course it was difficult.
And can you share with us a little bit about how,
what
were your
it
thought
was,
process?
It was difficult because at that time I was working in happily in OCBC. I had joined OCBC in '69 and then worked my way up. At the time, I was general manager of the bank. It was a job which was very fulfilling and which suited me well. And I liked the people I was working with, and prospects were very good. So when I was asked to join politics, first thing is I don't have the skills. I mean, I couldn't speak. My Malay was a bit. I could speak some Malay, but not Chinese, and I had never done public speaking on any scale. Neither have I gone around doing community work to any large extent. So it was a completely new world. So obviously you don't jump into a situation like that, which could be disastrous. And first, Mr. Hon Swee Sen spoke to me, and then Mr. Lee Kuan Yew spoke to me, and said, "You need good people go into politics." And after some months of thinking to it, I decided that it's something which I had to do, even though I would say that I was not a natural politician, even today. And it was a whole new world for me, going around meeting communities, and it was a very different setting from what I was used to. I was 39 years old at that time. I had to get used to a new lifestyle, get used to new circumstances, working with people. But it turned out well. I was a member of parliament in Sembawang for a long time, over 25 years. And in the end, I worked well with the people there. I think I got to know them, and not only them, but their children. I watched children growing up. And there was a bond between myself and them. And after a while, you feel an affection for them. So it was something which enriched my life. I hope I've done something for Sembawang. Even up to today, I still keep in connection with some of the people there as well.
But it's an important story and it's an important legacy. We were talking about change, and there are some things that we need to look back and wish it doesn't change. There are some policies which Singaporeans look back and say, wow, I'm glad it changed. And one of those controversial policy was during your time when you were Minister of State. You just actually replaced Dr. Goh Keng Swee as Education Minister in 1984. And we're talking really about the Graduate Mother Scheme. It was something that both Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and Dr. Goh had a hand in it. It was controversial back then. And when you took over as Education Minister, one of your earliest policy decision was to reverse that. How was that like, knowing that the very policy is reversing something that your predecessor, as well as Mr. Lee, had a hand in it? Was it difficult?
Of course it was difficult, This graduate mothers, this so-called graduate mothers policy was introduced by Dr. Goh Keng Swee and Mr. Lee Kuan Yew for good intentions. They've always been worried about our low birth rate, particularly among graduate mothers, and this was this big effort to persuade graduate mothers to have more children, and one of them was to give priority to their children in choosing schools. And it was a controversial policy because people felt that it's not fair. I mean, this is something you are visiting on young children through no fault of their own, right? It's something their parents may or may not have done, and it was not popular. And but I think Mr. Lee and Dr. Goh felt it was necessary in view of our birth statistics, I think. And even the graduate mothers who would benefit from this policy were unhappy about it. And it was quite obvious. I mean, they spoke out against it. They didn't like it. They felt it was, in a sense, perverse meritocracy. So when I took over as education minister, I decided to review the policy, and I took a few months to look at it and then see, does it work? I knew the intention. I said, what were results? And it was quite clear to me that it was not working at all. You know, that whatever be the objectives or the merits of putting out the policy, the results were negative. Right? So I thought that if the results were negative, it was not working, then it's better to take the bull by the horns and change it. And it's better to do it fairly quickly, because once it settles down, it's very difficult once you're in a new ministry and then there are people with objections. So I thought about it quite carefully over several months. I explained my reasons. Dr. Goh, by the time I had retired, I think, from the government, but I told Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, was then Prime Minister, that I think this is not working. I'm going to reverse it. And he was a great man. Basically, what he said was, you are in charge now. You have to do what you think is right. You know? So I explained in Parliament, I think, about why I did it. And I think it was the right policy, because after that, we changed it. There were different ways of doing it, other schemes, but there was something which had to be done fairly quickly. I'm glad it went off well.
In 1985, where we had one of our first back then, a major recession.
Yeah.
Before that, Mr. Lee have always insisted that no one touches the CPF, because that is, for him, almost a holy grail for our workers, for Singapore. But 1985 wasn't an ordinary recession, it was a major recession. You were back then the Trade and Industry Minister, concurrently you were Minister of Finance. So 1985,
I wasn't Minister of Finance.
Oh, it was after that?
It was after that, yeah.
So you were Trade and Industry Minister.
Trade and Industry Minister. I'm not sure. I could have been Minister. 83 I became Minister of Finance as well. 85, yes. That's right, yes.
I remember it was concurrent.
Yeah.
It was
concurrent, yes.
Yeah. And it was a difficult time for Singapore.
Difficult, very difficult time.
So would you share with us your own recollection of that episode, and you were a key actor in that. What did you have to do?
That's a long story. Yeah. Well, the 85 recession, we have always had ups and downs in the Singapore economy. Up to 85, we have been used to fairly high rates of growth, 8%. And the country was doing well. Some years a bit slow, but nevertheless, we always have positive growth. But in 85, a series of combinations, the worldwide situation, slowdown in our part of the world, came about in the first half of 1985, remember. And our economy went down very, very rapidly. Within a matter of months, companies were closing down, people were being retrenched, jobless rates were going up. And that, in a sense, puzzled me and my colleagues in the Ministry of Trade and Industry. We knew that it was going to slow down, but why did it slow down so fast? And with such widespread consequences, it could not just be economic factors or trade factors alone. There must be some other reason. And we discussed it, we brought in some experts, we talked about it. Then eventually I came to the conclusion, together with discussions from my colleagues, some people, that what happened was that we had pushed up our CPF rate too high. Technically, what happens is, when you push up your CPF rates, you are extracting money from the economy and, in a sense, sterilizing it by putting it into government bonds and so on. And in addition to the normal slowing down of the economy, monetary policy had a part to play with it. And this was due to the fact that our CPF rates were actually far too high. So again, I thought about it for quite some time. I discussed with my colleagues. I came to the conclusion that if we don't do something about the high CPF rates, this thing could go on and it will get even worse. And by the time our economy has slowed down to zero growth, which had never happened before, we had gone down to 4-5%, but never zero. So it puzzled me a great deal. So in the end, I said that no, we have to reduce our CPF rates. How much to reduce? That's a separate issue which we can discuss later. But the main principle is that we cannot keep our CPF savings rate so high and extract more money from the economy. So again, I mean, I went to cabinet. I explained my reasons. And Mr. Lee had been very much vocal in saying you should not cut it there. But he accepted the logic of the situation. So, and I made a speech, I remember, in late '85, saying that we should reconsider the level of our CPF rates because this is a situation we need to, in a sense, technically re-establish the supply of money back into the economy in order to aid the recovery. And it was accepted. And then after that, we considered how much to reduce. Different people had different ideas. And Mr. Lee actually was very good. He advocated a very large reduction in the CPF rate. And that changed the whole situation. So by '86, the economy had turned around again. And we are also an economic committee chaired by Mr. Lee Hsien Loong. So everything worked out well.
After that, you retired from cabinet, and we went through a very different type of, I would use an overarching word called crisis, where we had two of our deputy prime minister fell ill at almost a very similar time. And you were asked to come back to the cabinet, take on the role of deputy prime minister and defense minister. You were back then, you were already back in the corporate world, you were still a member of parliament for Sembawang. You really didn't have to come back, but you did. Can you take us through that decision?
I left the cabinet after the transition from Ms. Lee Kuan Yew to Mr. Goh Chok Tong in 1991. I'd always been had a great affection for OCBC, where I worked with previously, and they asked me to come back at that time because there were some transition problems there, and they didn't have anyone there to take over as chairman and CEO. So they approached me, and I thought, well, my job in the government is over. It's possible for me to go back to the bank, which I did as chairman and CEO from 1992. But life changes, and you can't plan for everything. Then, out of the blue, I think 2 years later, it turned out that both Ong Teng Cheong and Lee Hsien Loong were stricken with cancers, right? It was very, very serious indeed. And in a sense, there was some, I wouldn't say confidence in Singapore was shaken, but people were uncertain. What does this happen? Two deputy prime ministers
at the same time.
At the same time, So, and cabinet, Mr. Goh Chok Tong thought that, he just felt that we need to strengthen the cabinet. So I was asked to consider leaving the bank and going back, take over as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence, which is a big responsibility. This was very difficult because I had settled down in my job. I liked the bank, I liked the work, and I didn't want to leave the bank in a difficult positions. So I thought about it for several months indeed, But in the end, I felt that, the future of the country is at stake, and where I cannot let my own personal feelings or the prospects of the bank be affected by what could happen to the country. So I agreed to rejoin the cabinet in August 1995, I think, right? And it was, as I said, not an easy decision, because by the time you're always settled down. In '79, I was 39 years old. Now I was 55 years old. And it's not so easy to make a change at the time. But it turned out well, so I joined the cabinet, became DPM, Minister of Defence, stayed for 10 years until 2005.
Was the sense of duty the reason why you ran for the presidential election in 2011?
2011 was very unusual year.
Yeah.
I think there was some unhappiness with the government at the time.
Yeah.
The election results were not so good. I think the government lost a GLC, some seats and so on. Things were very uncertain out there. And I was very worried as to, you never know what happens. I mean, this sort of thing can unravel quite quickly, right? So I thought that the government needed some stability in order to reconsider its policies, rebuild its engagement with the people. And it's difficult for them unless you have got somebody in the presidency who can provide stability and with whom the government of day can work with. And that I was at that time chairman of SPH as well as deputy chairman, executive director of GIC. I was very, very comfortable in those jobs. I loved those jobs. But the interests of the country had to take precedence. So I decided to run in the presidential elections. It was very close. The campaigning was very difficult. Things were very confused. Some of the candidates were making all types of pronouncements, which obviously they can't fulfill because the elected president is not an executive authority. He can't initiate the action. He's a check and balance, but not an initiator. And I think that if this thing goes on, who knows what may happen. Well, fortunately, things turned out well. It was quite close, but in the end, I won. So 2011 to 2017, I served as president until August this year. And, it's a contribution which I could make. I was happy to make it.
On that note, Dr. Tan, thank you so much.
I hope this was useful.
No, it has been tremendously wonderful.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah.